The sun was a hammer, and the desert was its anvil. It beat down on the cracked earth, on the skeletal remains of scrub brush, and on the woman who stumbled through the heat haze. Her name was Elara, though the name felt like a relic from another life, a word whispered in a cool room with curtains drawn against this very glare. Now there was only the sun, the sand, and the relentless weight in her belly. She was heavy with child, a life that kicked and turned within her, oblivious to the fact that its sanctuary was about to become its tomb. Her water had run out yesterday. Her hope had run out this morning. Her vision began to swim, the distant mesas blurring into a watercolor wash of rust and violet. Her legs, which had carried her for days across this desolate expanse, finally betrayed her. They buckled. She fell, not with a cry, but with a silent, surrendering sigh. The sand was hot against her cheek. It smelled of dust and eternity. She closed her eyes. The sky was a pale, merciless blue. A black speck against it, then another, and another, and another. Vultures. They circled with an unnerving patience, casting fleeting, cross-shaped shadows over her body. They knew, as the desert always knew, that all things eventually return to the earth. She thought of the men she was fleeing, their hard faces and harder hands. They had called her husband's death a debt, and her the payment. She had run, carrying the only two things of value she had left, her pride and her unborn child. It seemed she would lose them both. The heat was a physical presence, a blanket that smothered her, pressing the last of her consciousness into a thin, fragile sheet. Then a new shadow fell over her. It was not the fleeting shadow of a wing. It was solid, broad, and it did not move. It blotted out the sun. Elara forced an eye open. A figure stood over her, a silhouette against the blinding sky. A man. He was tall, built of leather and wire, his face a landscape of sun-baked canyons and wind-carved lines. He carried a rifle in one hand and a waterskin slung over his shoulder. He did not speak. He crouched. He looked at her, at the swell of her belly, then up at the circling birds. His expression was unreadable, a mask of grim neutrality. He was a mountain man, a creature of silence and solitude, drawn down into the furnace of the flatlands by some unknown errand. He looked at her as he might look at a stranded calf or a fallen hawk, a part of the brutal calculus of the wild. For a long moment, he did nothing. He simply observed. She was a problem not of his making. He could walk away. The desert would claim her, and the world would continue to turn indifferent. His eyes, the color of faded slate, held no pity. But they held something else. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. Not of her, but of the scene. Of injustice. Of a life being ground into dust by forces it could not fight. He reached out, not to her, but to a small, smooth stone beside her head. He picked it up, weighed it in his palm, and with a flick of his wrist, sent it spinning into the air. It was not aimed at the vultures. It was a decision. He had weighed the cost of involvement against the cost of walking away. The stone fell back to the earth with a soft thud. He let out a slow breath. He slipped his rifle over his shoulder, knelt deeper, and slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. He lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-boned thing despite the life she carried. He stood, her body cradled against his chest, and turned his back to the sun. He began to walk, his steps even and measured, carrying her away from the circling shadows and toward the distant, hazy promise of the mountains. The world for Elara became a blur of motion and sound. The rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel, the leathery scent of the man's vest, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear. She was a ship, adrift and broken, now held fast in the unlikeliest of harbors. He did not speak. He just walked. The sun beat on his back, but she was in his shadow, a small mercy that felt monumental. Time lost its meaning. It was measured only in the changing angle of the sun and the growing ache in his unseen muscles. He was not a man. He was a machine of endurance. He walked as the sun climbed to its zenith, a malevolent eye in the sky. He walked as it began its slow descent, painting the clouds in streaks of blood and fire. When her lips grew too cracked to bear, he would stop. He would uncap his waterskin, tip a few precious drops onto his fingers, and press them to her mouth. The water was warm, but it was life. She would swallow, a faint, rasping sound in the vast silence. Her consciousness was a flickering candle flame. Sometimes she would wake enough to see his face, etched with a concentration so profound it looked like anger. His jaw was a line of granite. His eyes were fixed on the purple line of the mountains, a destination that seemed to move further away with every step he took. She was afraid. He was a stranger, a hard-looking man from a hard country, but the arms that held her were steady. They did not falter. The fear was a distant hum, drowned out by the overwhelming reality of his strength. This was not the rough, possessive grip of the men she had fled. It was something else. It was purposeful. It was a kind of custody, a responsibility he had simply decided to assume. Night fell. The desert grew cold with a startling suddenness. He found a shallow overhang of rock, a meager shelter against the wind. He gently laid her down, propping her head on a rolled-up blanket from his back. He built a small fire, the flames pushing back the immense, star-dusted darkness. He took a piece of jerky from his pouch, chewed it until it was soft, and offered her a small piece. She ate it slowly, the salty taste a shock to her system. He sat across the small fire, his rifle across his knees. He didn't sleep. He watched the darkness, his gaze sweeping the horizon. He was a sentinel, a guardian. He had not asked her name. He had not asked her story. He had simply seen a life that needed saving and had put his own strength between it and death. The second day was a crucible. The mountains were closer, no longer a hazy promise, but a solid, jagged reality. But the man was tiring. Elara could feel the subtle tremor in his arms, see the sheen of sweat on his brow that the dry air could not entirely erase. Yet he did not slow. His pace remained as relentless as the day before. He was in a war with the distance, and he would not concede an inch. He was carrying more than just her body. He was carrying her life, and the life of her child. The weight was immense, a burden that would have crushed a lesser man. He walked on. Through the afternoon, her fever broke. Her mind cleared slightly. She looked up at him, really looked at him, for the first time. The sun had bleached his hair to the color of dried straw. A scar, thin and white, ran from the corner of his eye into his hairline. This was the face of the man who was saving her. She did not know his name. She did not know why he was doing this. But as he carried her into the foothills, his boots finding purchase on the rising stone, she knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. He would not let her fall. The cabin was tucked into a fold of the mountain, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was made of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney and a roof of packed earth and hardy grass. It looked as though it had grown from the mountain itself. Silas, for that was his name, though she did not know it, yet kicked the door open with his boot. The interior was dark and cool. It smelled of pine smoke, leather, and solitude. There was one room. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. In the corner was a cot, a simple frame with a straw-stuffed mattress. He crossed the room in 3 strides and laid her down on it. The relief of a flat, stable surface was so profound it made her dizzy. He stood over her for a moment, his chest heaving with the first visible sign of his exhaustion. The 2-day trek was over. He had won his war with the desert. He turned away without a word and went to the hearth. He moved with a quiet economy, stoking the embers from the morning's fire, adding kindling until a small flame danced to life. He filled a cast-iron pot with water from a bucket by the door and set it on a hook over the fire. Elara watched him through heavy-lidded eyes. He was a man of routines, of practiced motions. There was no wasted energy. He took some dried herbs from a pouch and dropped them into the warming water, filling the small cabin with a clean, sharp scent. He was not a brute. He was capable. There was a difference. The discovery settled another layer of frayed nerves within her. She was weak, vulnerable, and entirely at his mercy. But perhaps mercy was a thing that existed here. He brought a steaming mug of the broth to her. He didn't try to help her drink it. He simply set it on the small crate beside the cot and stepped back, giving her space. His silence was not threatening. It was respectful. She struggled to sit up, her muscles screaming in protest. Finally, she managed to lean against the wall, her hands trembling as she lifted the mug. The warm liquid was a balm, soothing the raw scrape of her throat. She drank it all. It was the first warmth she'd felt inside her in what felt like a lifetime. When she was done, she looked at him. He was standing by the open door, looking out at the mountainside, his back to her. "Where?" She managed, her voice a dry rasp. He didn't turn. "Safe," he said. The word was low and rough, as if he was unaccustomed to using his voice. Safe. It was a word she hadn't dared to even think. He stepped outside, pulling the door until it was almost closed, leaving just a crack of light. She could hear him moving around outside. The rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. The scrape of a boot on stone. He was putting his world back in order. Inside the quiet cool of the cabin, Elara pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin. The man had a name for this place. Safe. For now, that was enough. It was more than enough. She let her eyes drift shut, not into the desperate oblivion of the desert, but into a deep, healing sleep, the sound of his axe, a steady, protective rhythm in the mountain air. Days bled into one another in a slow, quiet rhythm. The rhythm of the mountain. The rhythm of Silas. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet as he started the fire. He would leave a bowl of porridge and a mug of herbal tea on the crate beside her bed before heading out. He never woke her. He simply provided. Elara spent those first days in a state between waking and sleeping, her body slowly, painstakingly knitting itself back together. When she was awake, she would watch him from the cot. He was a man defined by his actions. He repaired the leather on his worn boots, his large hands surprisingly nimble with a needle and all. He patched a hole in the cabin roof. He spent an entire afternoon reinforcing a section of fence that kept the deer from his small vegetable garden. He moved with a placid, unhurried purpose that seemed to calm the very air around him. He was mending his world, one small piece at a time. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was not an empty, awkward silence. It was a weighted silence, full of things unspoken. He did not ask her questions, and she did not offer answers. Her story was a heavy, dangerous thing, and she was not yet strong enough to lift it. His story was locked behind the stony mask of his face, and he seemed in no hurry to share it. Their communication was a language of gestures. A nod from him when he saw she had eaten. A slight inclination of her head in thanks. It was enough. After a week, she felt a stirring of strength return. The child inside her was strong, its movements a constant, reassuring reminder of the life she was protecting. One morning, after Silas had left for the day, she swung her legs off the cot. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She stood, swaying for a moment, and then found her balance. She looked around the small, masculine space. It was clean but sparse. It was a shelter, not a home. She found a bucket of water and a rag. Slowly, methodically, she began to clean. She washed the single window until the mountain light streamed through it, clear and bright. She scrubbed the wooden table. She swept the stone floor. Then she saw it. One of his shirts, slung over the back of a chair, had a long tear in the sleeve. She found his mending kit, the one she'd seen him use on his boots. Her hands were still clumsy, but she threaded the needle and began to sew. The small, neat stitches were a familiar comfort, a domestic act that felt like an anchor in this strange new life. It was a tiny act of creation in a space that had been defined by solitude. When Silas returned at dusk, he stopped in the doorway. He took in the clean window, the swept floor. His gaze landed on the shirt, now neatly folded on the chair, the torn sleeve repaired with a row of tiny, even stitches. He looked from the shirt to her. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands folded in her lap, watching him. He didn't smile. His expression did not change. But he met her eyes, and in that shared look, something shifted. A silent acknowledgment passed between them. She had contributed. She had mended something. He had built the fence to keep the dangers out. She had stitched the fabric to make the shelter whole. He gave a single, curt nod. Then he turned to the hearth to start the evening fire, the first thread of a fragile trust woven between them in the quiet mountain air. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was a placid, late afternoon blue. The next it was bruised and purple, the color of a fresh wound. The wind began to howl, a low moan that rose to a shriek as it tore through the pines. Rain came down in hard, driving sheets, turning the world outside the window into a churning gray chaos. The storm trapped them. The cabin, which had felt like a small, manageable space, suddenly shrank. The air grew thick with their shared presence, the silence more pronounced against the roar of the wind and rain. Silas secured the door with a heavy wooden bar. He added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. He seemed untroubled by the storm. He was a part of this wild place. Its furies were familiar to him. He sat in his usual chair by the hearth, took a block of pine from his pocket and a small, sharp knife. He began to carve. Elara sat on the cot, watching him. The firelight played across his face, softening the hard lines, putting a warm glow in his slate-gray eyes. His hands were mesmerizing. The knife moved with a life of its own, peeling away slivers of wood, turning the block into something new. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air, mingling with the smell of wood smoke and rain. The forced proximity, the intimacy of the small, fire-lit space, loosened something in her. The words she had kept locked away began to press against her lips. "My name is Elara," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the storm's roar. He paused his carving. He didn't look up, but his hands went still. He was listening. She took a breath. "I was running." He still didn't look at her, but he gave a slight nod, an invitation to continue if she wished. "My husband, he died a few months ago. An accident at the logging camp. His family." She trailed off, the memory of their faces making her stomach clench. "They are not good men. They said he owed them a debt. They said I was part of the inheritance." The last words were barely a whisper. She looked down at her hands, ashamed, as if their cruelty was a stain upon her. Silas said nothing for a long moment. The only sounds were the fire and the storm. Then he resumed his carving, the knife once again making its soft, scraping sound against the wood. The simple, steady sound was more comforting than any words of pity could have been. He was not judging her. He was simply listening. He worked for another hour in silence. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a strange peace had settled. When he was finished, he stood up and walked over to her. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, exquisitely carved bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. The detail was incredible. He had etched every tiny feather. She looked from the bird to his face. He was finally looking directly at her, and his eyes held a deep, quiet solemnity. She reached out and took the bird. It was smooth and warm in her palm. It was a gift, a promise, an acknowledgement of her story, a symbol of the flight that had brought her here. She closed her fingers around it. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and returned to his chair by the fire, leaving her to hold the small, wooden soul of a bird that had been born from a block of wood in the heart of the storm. The air had the clean, sharp bite of coming autumn. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains washed and glistening. A sense of peace had settled over the small homestead, a fragile truce with the world. But the world had a long memory and a longer reach. Silas saw him first. He was mending the handle of an axe near the edge of the clearing, and his eyes, constantly scanning his domain, caught the movement. A rider, far down the slope, picking his way through the trees. Not a traveler. This man moved with the cagey watchfulness of a predator. Silas's body went still, every line of him hardening into a state of alert readiness. He set the axe down and walked calmly back to the cabin. He didn't run. His movements were deliberate. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. He opened the door. Elara was kneading dough on the table, a dusting of flour on her cheek. She looked up, a question in her eyes. "Inside," he said, his voice flat and low. "Stay away from the window." The tone, more than the words, sent a chill of fear through her. She had never heard that sound in his voice before. It was the sound of iron. She nodded, her hands stilling in the dough. She moved to the far corner of the cabin, pressing herself into the shadows. Silas stepped back outside, taking his rifle from the pegs beside the door. He didn't raise it. He just held it loosely in one hand, a casual extension of his arm. He stood on the small porch, waiting. The rider emerged from the tree line. He was a thick-set man with a florid face and small, mean eyes. He rode a tired-looking horse. He reined in just outside the fence line, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the neat stack of firewood, the small garden. He was taking inventory. "Howdy," the man called out, a false heartiness in his voice. Silas said nothing. He just watched him. The man, Jeb, shifted in his saddle, unnerved by the mountain man's silence. "Jebediah Thorne, me and my brothers, we're looking for something that belongs to us." His eyes flickered toward the cabin door. A woman, pregnant, might have passed this way. Silas's face was a mask of stone. He looked at Jeb as if he were a mildly annoying insect. "No one here but me," he said. The words were clipped, final. Jeb licked his lips, his gaze darting around again. He wasn't convinced. He had a tracker's instinct, and he smelled a lie. "Heard stories about you," Jeb sneered, trying to regain the upper hand. "The hermit of Stone Creek. Folks say you're half wild." Silas remained motionless. His silence was a weapon, more unnerving than any threat. Jeb could feel the danger radiating from him, a cold, still deadliness that had nothing to do with the rifle in his hand. "She's our property," Jeb insisted, his voice rising. "Her husband owed us. The law is on our side." "There's no law up here," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a chilling authority. "Just this mountain." He shifted his weight slightly, a barely perceptible movement that was thick with menace. "You should go." Jeb stared at him for a long, tense moment. He saw the truth in Silas's eyes. Not the truth about Elara, but the truth of what would happen if he pushed this. He was a bully, not a fool. He tugged on his reins, turning his horse. "We'll be back," he spat. "All of us, and we'll take what's ours." He kicked his horse into a trot and disappeared back into the trees. Silas stood there long after the sound of the hooves had faded, his eyes fixed on the spot where Jeb had vanished. The peace was broken. The fragile truce was over. The world, with its greed and its cruelty, had found them. The moment Jebediah Thorne disappeared into the woods, the air in the clearing changed. The quiet peace of the mountain was gone, replaced by the tense, humming silence of a coming battle. It was no longer a question of if the Thorns would return, but when. Silas turned and went back inside the cabin. He didn't speak of what had happened. He didn't need to. The grim set of his jaw told Elara everything. Her hands, still dusted with flour, were trembling. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. But as she watched him, something else rose to meet it. A defiant spark of hope. He wasn't afraid. He was preparing. His movements were a study in grim efficiency. He took the heavy wooden bar from the door and examined it, testing its strength. He went to a small, locked chest in the corner, a chest she had never seen him open. He unlocked it. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were boxes of cartridges. He began methodically loading his rifle. The click-clack of the mechanism, a series of sharp, metallic punctuation marks in the quiet room. He was a different man now. The silent homesteader who mended fences and carved birds was gone. In his place was a warrior, a man who understood violence intimately. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a solemn purpose. "When they come," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you will go to the root cellar." He pointed to a trapdoor she had barely noticed beneath a bearskin rug. "The entrance is small. They won't find it. You do not come out, not for any reason, you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She saw the plan in his eyes. He was going to face them alone. He would be the wall between her and them. She looked around the small cabin at the clean window, the mended shirt, the pot of dough on the table. In a few short weeks, this place had become the only sanctuary she had ever known. Now it was about to become a battlefield. She would not cower in a cellar while he fought for her. She stepped forward. "I can help," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I can load the rifle. I can fight." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the steel beneath it. He saw the resilient survivor, the woman who had crossed a desert to protect her child. He walked over to her, and for the first time, he reached out and touched her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. The touch was not comforting. It was commanding. "Your fight," he said, his gaze dropping to her swollen belly, "is to keep that child safe. Let me fight this one." Then she asked the question that had been sitting in her heart since the day he'd lifted her from the sand. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this for me?" He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the warrior slipped, and she saw a chasm of old, unhealed pain in his eyes. "Because no one should be hunted," he said softly. He let his hand fall. The statement was simple, but it held the weight of a lifetime. It was not just about her. It was about something that had happened long ago, on a different mountain, in a different life. He turned back to his preparations, leaving her with the resonance of his words. He was not just defending her. He was defending an ideal, a line he had drawn against the darkness of the world. The sun set, and a deep, watchful quiet descended. They did not light the main lamp, relying only on the low, flickering light from the hearth. They were a small island of warmth in a vast, cold darkness, and they knew the sharks were circling. They ate in silence, a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Every sound from outside, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, made Elara's heart leap into her throat. Silas seemed to hear none of it. He was in a state of deep, internal focus, his stillness more potent than any nervous pacing. He was a boulder, waiting for the inevitable tide. As the fire burned low, casting long shadows that writhed on the walls like ghosts, he finally spoke. His voice was low, the sound of stones grinding together. He did not look at her. He stared into the embers, as if the story were written there. "I had a place like this before," he began, "down south, in the piney woods." Elara remained perfectly still, sensing that this was a rare and fragile thing, a secret being unearthed from a deep grave. It wasn't as lonely. I had a wife. Her name was Anna. He said the name softly, a ghost on his lips. She had hair the color of wildflower honey, and a laugh that could make the birds sing. He paused, and in the silence, Elara could almost hear that laugh. We had a boy, Daniel. He was only 5. All knees and elbows and questions. A flicker of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips and vanished. The smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes held only the fire's reflection. The town grew, he continued, his voice hardening. A railroad was coming through. A man named Blackwood wanted the land, all of it. He had money, and men who weren't afraid to use their fists, or worse, to get him what he wanted. He picked up a small stick and began to poke at the coals, his knuckles white. I told him no. This was our home. I was a fool. I thought a fence and a locked door were enough. I thought the law would protect us. He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. Blackwood's men came one night. They said it was a warning. They set fire to the barn. But the wind was high. It jumped to the house so fast. His voice broke, just for a second, a crack in the granite. He cleared his throat. I was out, trying to save the horses. Anna, she went back in. For Daniel. He was afraid of the dark. He stopped. He didn't need to say the rest. The story hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The fire, the house, the wife and child he couldn't save. He had failed to protect them, so he had run. He had run from the ashes, from the memory, from the man he had been. He had come here, to this lonely mountain, to build a fortress of solitude around his guilt. He had become a hermit, a ghost, a man who mended things because his own life was broken beyond repair. He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with the telling. I won't fail again, he said. It was not a promise. It was not a statement. It was a vow, spoken to the ghosts in the firelight. This fight was not about Elara. It was about Anna and Daniel. It was his chance, in the harsh court of his own soul, to finally deliver a verdict of redemption. They came just before dawn, in the gray liminal hour between night and day. 3 figures on horseback, materializing from the mist like wraiths. Jebediah Thorne and his 2 brothers, Caleb and Marcus. They were burly, bearded men, confidence rolling off them in waves. They saw a lone cabin, a single man. They saw an easy victory. They dismounted outside the fence, leaving their horses untied. They carried rifles, but held them loosely, arrogantly. This was a simple reposition in their minds. Silas! Jeb bellowed, his voice shattering the morning calm. We know she's in there. Send her out, and we'll let you live on your miserable rock. Silas stood on the porch, his own rifle held in the crook of his arm. He looked calm, almost sleepy. I told you, he said, his voice even. There's no one here but me. Don't play dumb with us, mountain man, snarled Caleb, the younger, more hot-headed brother. He raised his rifle. We tracked her right to the edge of this cursed mountain. She's here. Silas's gaze flickered from one brother to the next. He was calculating, measuring. She's not a thing you can claim, he said, the words low and dangerous. She's a person, and this is my land. Turn around and ride away. Marcus, the oldest and seemingly the calmest, stepped forward. Look, we don't want trouble. But our brother's dead, and she carries his child. That child is a thorn. That makes her our business. Now be reasonable. It was the word reasonable that did it. The memory of another man, Blackwood, using that same word before he burned Silas's world to the ground. Something cold and hard settled in Silas's eyes. The time for reason is over, he said, and then the world exploded into motion. It wasn't a duel. It wasn't a standoff. It was a blur of brutal, practiced violence. As Caleb lifted his rifle to aim, Silas was already moving. He didn't fire. He dropped, rolling off the porch and coming up behind the stacked firewood. A shot from Caleb splintered the log where his head had been. A second shot from Jeb tore through the cabin wall, perilously close to the corner where Elara was hidden. Silas, now unseen, was a phantom in the morning mist. He knew every rock, every tree, every shadow of this land. They were city bullies in a world they did not understand. He moved. Marcus was trying to get a clear line of sight on the cabin when Silas emerged from behind the woodpile, not with his rifle, but with the axe he had been mending. He threw it. The axe spun end over end, a glittering arc of death in the gray light, and buried itself in Marcus's chest. He went down without a sound. One. Jeb and Caleb began firing wildly, their shots chewing up the landscape. They were panicked now, shooting at ghosts. Silas had already circled around to the far side of the fence. He rose from behind a granite boulder, his rifle at his shoulder. His aim was steady, his breathing even. He was not angry. He was merely performing a task, a grim, necessary task. He sighted on Caleb, who was reloading, his hands fumbling with the cartridges. One shot, clean and precise. Caleb crumpled to the ground. Two. Jebediah screamed in rage and fear, wheeling around, firing his last shot blindly into the trees. He turned to run for his horse, his bravado stripped away, leaving only a terrified, craven core. Silas did not shoot him in the back. He stepped out from behind the rock. "Thorn," he called. Jeb froze, turning slowly. He saw Silas standing there, rifle lowered, his face like a death mask in the dawn. There was no mercy in his eyes. There was only judgment. Jeb made a desperate, clumsy grab for the pistol at his belt. He never cleared the holster. Silas's rifle came up. The final shot echoed across the valley. A single, definitive sound. 3. Silence descended once more. The mist swirled around the 3 fallen bodies. The sun broke over the mountain's peak, its light spilling into the clearing, illuminating the scene of swift, terrible justice. The echo of the last shot faded, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the copper gong of blood. Silas stood for a long moment, the rifle still warm in his hands, his breath pluming in the cold morning air. He surveyed the scene. 3 men, who had ridden up the mountain full of greed and arrogance, now lay still upon the earth. They were just bodies now, their threats silenced forever. A wave of exhaustion, deep and bone-weary, washed over him. It wasn't the physical toll of the fight, which had been brutally short. It was the weight of what he had done. He had invited violence back into his life, the very thing he had run to this mountain to escape. He looked at his hands. They had taken 3 lives, but they had saved 2. He lowered the rifle and leaned it against the cabin wall. He was breathing heavily, a slight tremor in his legs. He looked down and saw the dark stain spreading across his left thigh. In the blur of the fight, he hadn't even felt it. Jeb's last wild shot had found its mark. The cabin door creaked open. Elara emerged, blinking in the new morning light. She was pale, her eyes wide, but she was not hysterical. She took in the scene with a horrifying calm. She saw the bodies. She saw the blood on the ground. Then she saw Silas, leaning against the wall, his face ashen, his hand pressed against his leg. The resilient survivor, the woman who had been hunted and terrorized, did not shrink. She did not cry. Her own fear was a distant thing, eclipsed by a fierce, urgent need. She walked past the fallen men as if they were nothing more than stones in her path. She went to him. "You're hurt," she said. It was not a question. He grunted, a sound that was half pain, half dismissal. "It's nothing." but she could see the way the blood pulsed between his fingers. It was not nothing. "Sit," she commanded, her voice imbued with an authority he had never heard from her. To his own surprise, he obeyed, sliding down the rough log wall to sit on the porch. She disappeared into the cabin and returned a moment later with a bucket of clean water, rags, and the small knife he used for carving. She knelt before him, her hands surprisingly steady as she began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his trousers. Just as she exposed the ragged wound, a sharp, profound tremor racked her body. Her breath hitched. She gasped, her hands flying to her own belly. Silas looked up, his own pain forgotten. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She looked at him, her eyes a mixture of fear, pain, and a kind of wild, incredulous wonder. "The baby," she breathed. "It's coming." The violence of the morning, the terror, the sudden, shocking relief, it had all conspired to send her body into labor. There, in the blood-soaked dawn, surrounded by the quiet dead, a new life was demanding its beginning. The cycle of death and birth, turning in its rawest, most elemental form, on the porch of a lonely cabin on a silent mountain. The world shrank to the confines of the small cabin. Outside, the bodies of the Thorne brothers lay under a blanket of freshly fallen leaves, a grim tableau that the mountain was already beginning to reclaim. Inside, a different, more primal battle was being fought. Silas, his leg crudely but effectively bandaged by Elara before her own ordeal consumed her, moved with a pained, limping urgency. He stoked the fire until the cabin was filled with a sweltering heat. He boiled water. He tore his cleanest shirts into soft strips of cloth. The man who had faced down 3 armed men with icy calm was now utterly terrified. This was a wilderness he did not know, a fight for which he had no weapons. He could mend a fence, track a deer, and kill a man, but the mystery of birth was a territory more frightening than any he had ever navigated. He followed Elara's instructions, his face a mask of grim concentration. His hands, which could be so brutally efficient, learned a new kind of gentleness. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth. He gave her his hand to grip, and she held on with a strength that threatened to crush his bones. He absorbed her pain, her cries, his own wound a dull, distant ache in comparison. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky. The struggle in the small cabin was timeless, elemental. It was the sound of pain and effort, the smell of sweat and blood, the desperate, ferocious will of life to exist. And then, as dusk painted the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, it was over. A new sound filled the room. A thin, reedy cry, yet a cry that held the power to push back the silence of death and grief. A son. Elara lay back, exhausted but luminous, the tiny red-faced infant nestled in the crook of her arm. Silas stood by the hearth, leaning heavily on the mantel, watching them. He was a stranger in his own home. The cabin, once a bastion of his solitude, a monument to his grief, was now irrevocably changed. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a nursery. It was a sanctuary. The days that followed were a slow, quiet dance of healing. Elara's strength returned, her focus entirely on the new life she held. Silas's leg began to mend. The silence between them changed, too. It was no longer weighted with unspoken trauma. It was now filled with the soft gurgles and cries of the baby. Winter arrived, blanketing the mountain in a deep, profound silence. The snow fell, burying the graves Silas had dug on the far side of the clearing, erasing the last physical traces of the violence that had brought their new world into being. The cabin became their entire universe, a small, warm bubble of life against the vast, frozen landscape. The rhythms of their life were simple, dictated by the needs of the baby and the demands of survival. Silas hunted, his movements now quiet and sure on a handmade crutch. Elara made the cabin a home. She cooked, she mended, She sang soft lullabies to Daniel. The space, once so starkly masculine, softened under her touch. She hung dried herbs from the rafters. She fashioned a small curtain for the window out of a spare blanket. She created comfort where there had only been function. They still spoke little, but their shared language of gestures and glances deepened into a form of profound intimacy. A look from him across the room as she rocked the baby was a question. "Are you all right?" Her small smile in return was the answer. "We are safe." He spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, carving. He no longer carved just birds. He carved a tiny, perfect wolf for Daniel to grasp in his fat fist. He carved a small, sturdy horse. He was populating his son's world with the symbols of his own. The silence of his grief was slowly being replaced by the quiet industry of a father. One night, a blizzard descended, a howling vortex of wind and snow that shook the very logs of the cabin. Daniel was fretful, crying with a colic that nothing seemed to soothe. Elara walked the floor with him, her face etched with weariness. Silas watched them, his usual helplessness in the face of the baby's cries warring with a new protective instinct. He limped over to them. He didn't speak. He simply held out his arms. Hesitantly, Elara passed the wailing infant to him. Silas held the small, warm body against his broad chest. He began to hum, a low, rumbling tune with no discernible melody. It was the sound of the mountain, of the wind in the pines, a sound from deep within him. He walked the floor, his limp a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind outside. Slowly, miraculously, Daniel's cries subsided. His tiny body relaxed against Silas's chest, and he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Elara watched them, a lump forming in her throat. The stoic protector, the silent killer, the grieving hermit, he was also this. A man who could soothe a child with a tuneless song in the heart of a storm. The winter thawed. The snow receded, revealing the green shoots of a new spring. The world was waking up, and so were they. The pain of their pasts had not vanished. It was woven into the fabric of who they were. But it was no longer the whole of their story. Scars remained, but scars are proof of healing. They had found each other in the desert, two broken, solitary souls. They had weathered the storm. They had faced the darkness and survived. And in the quiet aftermath, they had built something new from the wreckage. They had built a family. Years passed. They passed not in days or weeks, but in the turning of seasons, each one leaving its mark on the land and on their lives. The boy, Daniel, grew. He grew from a babe in arms to a toddler who chased butterflies in the summer meadow, his laughter echoing in the mountain air that had once known only silence. He had his mother's gentle eyes and Silas's quiet, watchful nature. The fence around the cabin was strong, its posts silvered with age. The garden was larger, yielding beans and squash and potatoes that Elara stored for the winter. The cabin itself seemed to have settled more deeply into the earth, a permanent fixture of the landscape. It was a home, in the truest sense of the word. One late summer evening, they sat together on the porch. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the valley. The air was still and sweet with the scent of pine. Daniel was asleep inside, clutching the small wooden wolf Silas had carved for him years ago. Silas reached over and took Elara's hand. His palm was calloused and rough, but his touch was gentle. Her hand fit into his as if it were made to be there. They didn't speak. They simply sat, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and purple, their shared silence a comfortable blanket woven from years of trust and unspoken affection. He was no longer just the stoic protector, and she was no longer just the resilient survivor. They were Silas and Elara, partners, parents, the architects of this small, peaceful world. The ghosts of Anna and Daniel, and the specter of the Thorn brothers, had not disappeared. They were part of the foundation of this life, the dark soil from which this unexpected flower had grown. but their power to haunt had faded, replaced by the vibrant, demanding presence of new life and new love. Here ends the story of the mountain man and the woman he carried from the desert. It is a story of how two broken souls, lost in the wilderness of their own grief, can build a home in the heart of another. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not found in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. It is a reminder that even in the most desolate of places, hope can take root and a family can bloom. Before you go, tell us, what is the heaviest thing you have ever carried for someone else?